Stop trying to force them into little boxes.
Welcome to Teaching While Queer, where we are providing queer folks working in education with a community to feel less alone and unload the burden of identity politics so you can work and live as your authentic self. I'm your host, Brian Stanton. My pronouns are he, they. I am a theater pedagogue and educator in New York City, and I am so pleased to have you here. Please enjoy Teaching While Queer. Through today's conversation, you will gain insights into navigating professional environments as a queer individual, understanding the importance of inclusive education and its impact on student well-being, and learn practical strategies for fostering supportive spaces for LGBTQ plus individuals in educational settings. Hi, Jo. How are you doing today?
Hi, Brian. I'm absolutely fine, thank you.
I'm fantastic, and I'm so excited to spend some time with you. Do you mind telling everybody at home who's listening a little bit about yourself?
I am Jo Peacock. She, her are my pronouns. I am an out lesbian within the teaching community. I am married to my wonderful wife, Kim. I have to call her wonderful because otherwise I'll suffer afterwards. But I work in the IT space. So I am an educator of IT, namely IT governance, which is all about managing IT and how we manage our technology. I teach adult students mainly. I also teach at universities too as an adjunct for those universities that have my discipline in their curriculum, which it's becoming more and more popular. So I spend a lot of time dealing with members of the public, doing keynote speaking, and also teaching online, teaching in classrooms. So it's quite a varied role that I have.
Yeah, that sounds like it's going to be on demand soon, especially with all of the IT work that's happening, not only in education, but just like unilaterally. Every company has an IT department, and knowing the governance and the rules and all that stuff is going to become, I guess, more necessary, especially as it develops. I'm just thinking about AI right now. So
IT has definitely, I mean, obviously, I've been in the game for quite a while. I'm not young anymore, but IT has moved from a nice to have to something that absolutely every organization, every single educational facility has to have. You can't function without IT. You can't pay your bills without IT.
do you mind sharing where you are in the world?
Sure. Well, obviously, with this accent, you might think that I was in London, and I'm not. I used to be. I now live in Niagara Falls on the US side of the border. So I'm in kind of Lewiston area, although I spend a lot of time doing sort of cross-border shopping, should we say. I don't suppose I should admit that too much. So my nearest big city is either Buffalo or Toronto. So I spend a lot of time in those cities. Namely Toronto. Our daughter lives in Toronto, so we're mainly up there, and of course we have to go to Pride every year because there's nothing like Toronto Pride. If you haven't been, go. It's fantastic.
Gosh, I want to. And honestly, I keep looking at that 8-hour train ride from New York City to Niagara Falls. So maybe we'll be catching you there too, because it's one of the 7 wonders of the world. It's something you want to see, and I can't wait.
It's wonderful living here. It really, really is. And we get the best of both worlds living here. We have our queer community on this side of the river and also on the other side of the river as well, which is absolutely amazing. And I am actively involved in both. So it really is a great place to live.
That's awesome. Well, let's take a journey back in time. You said that you were in London, and I'm curious what life was like for you as a queer student.
Well, I'm going to admit it wasn't recent that way. And when I was a student, it was something that we did have a lot of queer students within our university environment, but it wasn't something that we really spoke about. And it wasn't something that was publicized. We just were, I guess, underground for the most part. And it wasn't until we moved into the 1980s and 1990s, and it wasn't really until we moved into the 1990s that we started hearing about more of an LGBTQ plus presence. Before that, really, it wasn't something that we spoke about. And as a student, we had no support whatsoever. And it was incredibly difficult as a student in the US equivalent of high school because we did not know anything about who we were. I spent a lot of time as a student not really understanding who I was and understanding that my parents had forced me down this very straight path, this path where I would get married, I would have children, I would marry a man. And that was the norm. And so, to be perfectly honest, that was what was pushed at me. And that was something that I honestly thought, well, that was the way life was. And whether it made me happy or not didn't matter. There wasn't certainly anybody that was telling me that there was any alternative out there. Now, all of my friends happened to be gay. So all of my friends happened to be guys. And that was strange, wasn't it? And we all kind of got together, but there was still this unspoken thing. We just didn't talk about it at all. And I really felt as though there was an opportunity there for the faculty, for all of the teaching staff, to reach people in a way that, we weren't being heard and we weren't being understood, but we didn't know any different. And that was just how life was. And it wasn't until you start moving into adulthood that you realize, no, I'm okay, actually. This is normal. I'm okay. It's just that nobody really knew how to relate to us. My parents never knew how to relate to me, and no one else of that generation knew how to relate to us. And that's a huge change now. I see a huge difference now in the way that we talk to our students, in the way that we interact with our students, and the way that we encourage our students.
Absolutely. I'm coming at this from like the early 90s is kind of my first memories of school. It's funny because I listen to people say, that queer people are grooming children to be queer people, but like my whole life I was groomed to be straight, quite literally. It
Yeah.
was everywhere, at school, at home, movies, television shows, societal expectations, and yet here I am. If it worked the way that people are saying that it works, we wouldn't exist.
I spent my teenage years believing there was something wrong with me. And that in itself is quite damaging to any kid. It really is. But I spent my teenage years believing there was something wrong with me because I didn't have the feelings that were imposed on me, the feelings that were expected. So my parents and everybody else I knew had imposed this, this society on me, and I didn't feel as though I was a part of that. I didn't feel as though I belonged anywhere, and I really didn't know what was wrong with me because I wasn't experiencing the things that everybody else was experiencing in the same way. And so I really, when the media talks about we're imposing our gay agenda on people, and I'd still like to know what that agenda is, because if it doesn't involve being fabulous, then I'm out. But we hear about this all the time, but we don't hear about this straight agenda that's imposed on all kids. And that's a tragedy, to be honest, to have a kid who is growing up. And I think about our kids who are trans, and to have a kid who is growing up not understanding why they feel the way that they do and not having any support system in place. And I know that that must have been hard for me, but it must have been even harder for those trans kids that were around my age at that time, because they would have had absolutely nothing at all.
Absolutely. You're so correct. And it's such a shame because I think that people just need to treat children with care. So let's talk about that. You work with adults, either teaching adjunct at universities or with the general public, educating them on IT governance. So how does your experience as a queer student and that kind of growing up without this representation, how does that inform your work in education?
Wow. So I laugh and I hesitate about that because it depends on where I'm teaching as to how that has really influenced the way that I work. When I'm working with universities, it's heartwarming, to be perfectly honest, because we have a group of students, a group of young adults who are very certain about who they are. And that is heartwarming for me. And it actually makes standing in a classroom a pleasure, because I know that these students know who they are. I know that these students are comfortable with who they are. And I also know that these students are comfortable talking to me about who they are as well. So it really makes for a very warm environment. But not all of my teaching is done in classrooms at universities. And quite often I have to go into organizations and teach. Sometimes I have worked with organizations where I have been made to feel incredibly uncomfortable. Organizations where I really do not want to be there. I have been informed that I have to tone down who I am when I'm teaching. I don't walk into a classroom and talk about my wife. I just don't, for two reasons. One is because my personal life is my personal life and I keep that separate. But the other reason is I don't know who my audience is going to be. I never know who they're going to be. And in some instances, I have been in deeply red environments where I've had to be very, very careful. And in which case, I present completely differently. And that's very limiting. It's very limiting when you're trying to teach. When you are trying to impart knowledge and when you are trying to help people understand and you yourself feel uncomfortable, that's incredibly limiting. But there are times when I have walked into a classroom wearing a dress, wearing stilettos, wearing makeup, and feeling so uncomfortable. And the only thing that does this for me, the reason why I do this is because that's how I was conditioned as a child. When you felt uncomfortable, you just got on with it. You just had to deal with it and you just had to get on with it. And so there are times when I have to do that. And why do I do that? I can't explain other than it makes me feel incredibly nervous if I don't. But I don't have an answer for why I do it.
I've been put in situations because I work in theater education, and a lot of the times that means that I'm also responsible for any of the special events that happen on campus. And I've had to stage manage and direct Republican politicians coming in to talk about their current agenda that they are working on politically, even though it might be your space. Like, even if somebody's coming to you, because in that instance, it's my space, right? But when all these people enter my space and have that same kind of belief, it really does make you feel physically uncomfortable. And I always I'm a non-binary person. I identify as queer unilaterally. So gender and sexuality, that's where I'm sitting. And so for the most part, though, I'm a collared shirt, slacks, or shorts type of person just because I'm comfortable in it. I'm comfortable in that for my body. But I'm also a metallic nail polish, blue hair, nose ring person. And I find ways to express my gender that are more correct for me. And in those environments, I mean, I've had sometimes where I've flipped my septum piercing up. I've made sure to take my nail polish off. I do little things because having the hair isn't necessarily going to, trigger a response from somebody. But this kind of when your job is putting you in uncomfortable situations and being raised by folks who are like, suck it up and you got to do what you got to do. It's really hard to get past that. And also you have to look out for you have a daughter and you have a wife and you need to, bring home the bacon, as it were, and make sure you pay the house payment, and all those things come into play, and it's so frustrating. But that actually segues nicely into the next thing I wanted to talk about is what do you do when you're confronted with anti-queer behavior?
So that answer is twofold because the answer really goes back to, I guess there are two answers as to whether it affects me or whether it affects the students. If it affects me, I'm more likely to just sort of suck it up and just get on with it and really just ignore the impact and just get on with it. I was working at a studio in a red state and I was recording training material. And during that time, we had a Republican senator come in to record some promotional videos. I'm not too sure exactly what he was doing. And I was informed that he would be coming in, and I was told that I really needed to stay away from him. And there was an inference there that I was going to say something. And my first thought was, you know what? I'm not a non-professional person, so please don't assume that I'm going to be. Um, but my second thought was, this is who I am, and you're asking me to change who I am to accommodate somebody else. And it made me feel uncomfortable. But how did I deal with it? I kind of just got on and thought, okay, it's like that, is it? And I just avoided that particular person. And I was put in a situation by the same organization a few months later where I was doing some live camera work. So we were streaming live, and I was asked not to mention the fact that I was LGBTQ plus. I was asked not to mention the fact that I had a wife, and we don't want to alienate people. We don't want to alienate people. I walked out. That's how I dealt that. I walked out. I said, that's it. As far as I'm concerned, that's just, not only is it discrimination, but there is absolutely no way that I would be respected. But also, there's nothing I could have done about it. We were in a deeply red state, and despite the fact that discrimination laws exist, there was no way that anything could happen. So I guess I'm quite forceful. I'm quite outspoken in that sense. I will tolerate up to a point, but after that, then it's no more. But if it's my students, and I've had instances where I've been in a classroom and where I had one particular classroom where we were on a 3-day course, and there was one particular person in the room that was misgendering another student. And this student had repeatedly asked this person not to misgender them. And nevertheless, this other student kept doing this. And so I pulled the student that was affected by it, I pulled them aside and just asked how they were feeling. How does this impact your learning ability? And what can I do to help? And what they had said to me was, it's okay, I'm used to it. And my reaction was, you shouldn't have to be used to it. I am not tolerating this. This is my classroom. This is no one else's classroom. It's not that person's classroom. This is my classroom, and I'm in charge of it. And so the person that was actually being offensive in my eyes and in the other person's eyes, I pulled them to one side and I just said to them, you are deliberately misgendering this person, and it's become obvious to everybody else in the classroom that you are doing this deliberately. Can you tell me whether you plan on continuing this behavior? And they said, absolutely. This person is dressed in this way, and therefore this makes them this. And I just immediately turned around to them and said, well, I'm going to have to ask you to take your books and to leave the classroom, because you are not going to be part of this class anymore. I won't deal with it. It's not a great environment for students. I know what I went through as a young adult, and I'm not going to allow anybody else to go through that. And perhaps I'm being incredibly protective, but that's my job. I'm here as an educator. And the other thing that I look at this is that as an educator, I am shaping the views and shaping the behavior of future leaders. That's what and so my responsibility is to ensure that they get not only a good education, but that they get a perspective that empowers them and not a perspective that oppresses them. I know what I had. I know it didn't do a heck of a lot for my confidence. So I don't want to put anybody else into that position.
Absolutely. There's a couple of things that you mention in your stories that I think that are worth highlighting. First of all, it's frustrating to me that we are consistently treated as though we are going to be the aggressor by people who are aggressive with us. So the instance with the Republican politician or conservative politician coming in to do work, and they're like, you need to stay away from him because they were worried you were going to say something. Like, we're the ones that are being beaten. We're the ones that are having words slung at us. We're the ones that are dying. And yet somehow we're the aggressive person. So, and I'm looking at you. For those who are listening, I mean, she's a very lovely white woman with short hair, clearly not an aggressive person just from the look at you. And it's frustrating to me that in order to make I'm assuming, white, heterosexual, straight male feel comfortable, they needed to tamp down the tiny bit of difference that you hold, like, compared to other cisgender white women. So that I found incredibly frustrating. I also love the fact that you pointed out the behavior and said, like, I don't want to know what your problem is. When I'm in classroom and I'm teaching, I'm not necessarily trying to change people's mind about me. I'm just trying to be me. I'm trying to teach the material, and that's all there is to it. And when you're working in adult settings, we have the luxury. This isn't necessarily the case for the K through 12 teachers, but we have the luxury in college settings as well as in training courses like the one you're just mentioning, a 3-day seminar, to say you can leave. There's another section you can sign up for, and you don't have to be in this course with me. And I don't care what behind the scenes paperwork needs to happen. I will take care of that paperwork so that that person does not need to be in this space. Because if you can't be respectful, you don't need to be here.
That's exactly who I am. I mean, you mentioned, I think authenticity was a word that you used, and I'm comfortable now in who I am. I'm comfortable in my own space. Do I find myself in situations sometimes where I do feel uncomfortable? Absolutely. And I think we all do. And I think as queer people, we all do. You know, there is always going to be a time when you walk into a coffee shop and somebody behind you is having a conversation that makes you feel incredibly uncomfortable. We're not past all of that. I wish we were past all of that, but we're not. And so how you handle that is really key. And what I don't want to do, and what I'm very conscious of in a classroom, is I don't want to validate their thoughts and their opinions and their feelings. I'm not going to validate that, because what's important to me is the person that's feeling oppressed. And what's important to me is that everybody is treated exactly the same in my classroom. I don't care who you are. I don't care what your background is. And I honestly don't care what your beliefs are. But if you are bullying somebody else in my classroom, then I'm going to do something about it. And I am in a position of authority in that classroom. And you might not like the fact that you have got a lesbian woman in a position of authority, but you know what? The door's over there. You don't have to stay here. And that to me is about really ensuring that everybody has an equal opportunity to learn. That's what's important to me. I want everybody to walk away from a class feeling as though they've learned something and feeling as though they've had value in that class. Walking away feeling bullied, feeling picked on, feeling depressed. You know, that's exactly what I don't want to happen. There's enough of that goes on outside of the classroom. I don't want it to happen under my watch, as it were. And, you know, when you said there, I look sort of quite soft and I look, or I don't know that was the word you used, but, you know, I look quite placid. Oh, I'm not. And my wife will tell you otherwise. But yeah, I'm definitely not. And I think that comes with confidence in the, you know, I'm going to stand up for myself and I'm going to stand up for other people as well, because there's not enough of that, I don't think.
Yeah. I think that the word I used was non-aggressive. But regardless, everybody should have that little fire in them to be able to fight back when they need to, no matter how soft and cuddly they look on the outside. You mentioned that now you are comfortable with your own like confidence and your authenticity in your space. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting out about being authentic at work?
One step at a time. And that's probably my approach to absolutely everything. Is if it's something that scares you, if it's something that you feel nervous about, if it's something that you're feeling wary, and you know, some people, not everybody is confident. That's why I'm a teacher, because I'm pretty outward in sort of, you know, in who I am, but not everybody is like that. And so I say one step at a time. change one little thing about you. Be yourself in one little way and do it gradually. So for me, it was really about moving and transitioning towards being comfortable with myself. A lot of this was about outward appearance. I grew up in a way that I was forced into this sort of formative sort of behavior. And so I grew up wearing stiletto heels, wearing dresses, wearing a whole ton of makeup, having my hair long, etc. And so what I found was I changed one little thing. The first thing I did was I changed from wearing dresses into wearing pants or trousers, as I would call them. And that was something that made me feel incredibly comfortable. And it was so empowering. And it was such a tiny, tiny little change, but it felt so empowering. And all of a sudden, I was walking with a lot more confidence. Was I still wearing stilettos? Absolutely. Did I still have some makeup on? Sure, I did. And then I had my hair cut. And so I did little things, gradual things, one step at a time. Don't try and do everything all at once. What will happen is you will walk into a classroom or any environment and you will look completely different if you try and change everything. You'll act in a completely different way. And you know what's going to happen? Somebody's going to turn around and say to you, oh, you look different. And the minute they do that, the seeds of doubt start appearing in your head. The minute somebody says something about your appearance or your behavior, you start doubting yourself. One thing at a time. That's all I would say. Change one little thing about you. Get comfortable with that. Get comfortable with wearing trousers in public. Get comfortable with that and then think, okay, now I'm going to switch to brogues because I really find them comfortable. And, you know, my first pair of brogues were absolutely hilarious. They were silver. I mean, so obvious. I loved them. I still have them now, 20 years later. But, you know, switch something, just something small. And you'll find that you will soon become a lot more confident in who you are.
I think that's such great advice because there is this mentality of like, you have to show up all or nothing. And I think that taking those baby steps is so important because, as you mentioned, it helps to build your confidence. Each step is a step towards a more confident you. And I think that's so necessary, especially right now, because when we're living in such a turbulent time, those little things are actually big things for you personally in a world that's telling you to like, we want you to be quiet. We want you to go back into the closet. We don't want to hear from you. We don't want you to have right. All of these things are happening. But if you're just like, I'm going to get my ears pierced, or I'm going to cut my hair short, or I'm going to wear pants, then that little bit is just like taking up your space in the world the way that you want to be. The more that you do that, the more you'll get comfortable taking up legitimate space in the world.
I think it's very scary at the moment, certainly in the States anyway. I know that life is different outside of the States, but certainly in the US, it's very scary at the moment. When I first moved to the US, I was teaching, so I came over as a teacher. And I was teaching. It's what I've always done. And I was on my way back to the UK. And at the time, I was traveling every week. So every weekend, I was in an airport and doing a transatlantic flight. And I was sat at an airport in the south, Charlotte Airport. It's a large airport. And on the flight to London, there was a young person. And they were sitting there. They had sort of pink hair and they had what looked like all their worldly belongings about them. And they were probably in their late teens, maybe early 20s. And they were crying. And I sat next to this person and I said, are you okay? Can I help? What's happening? Is there anything I can do? And they said to me, I'm going to London because I've heard that it's friendlier. And I said, well, it depends on where you go. Some places are friendly, some places aren't. And it was at that moment that I felt really pleased that I had gained the confidence to dress and to act and be who I am. Because then this person said to me, no, by friendlier, I mean, I've heard that it's friendlier to people like us. And I said, well, from where we are, yes, I can say that. But what do you want to get out of this? And they said to me, they confided in me that they'd come out to their parents, and their parents had gone to their pastor, and the pastor had told their parents that if they didn't change who they were, then the parents had to disown them, and the parents were never to speak to them again. And so this poor little thing was getting on a plane to London all by themselves, without anybody, without knowing anybody, because they had heard that people were friendlier in London and that people were more accepting in England. And, that broke my heart. That really did. And I can't tell you what I wanted to do to the parents. I mean, I didn't ask for their name, and it's a good job. But it absolutely broke my heart that was happening. And I just think that we're in a worse situation than we were. That was 12, 15 years ago. We're in a worse situation than we were then. And that makes me sad. So if I can do just a tiny little bit, whether it's in a classroom or when I do mentoring, sometimes if I can do just a tiny little bit to try and change that, or to try and give somebody a bit of confidence, a bit of self-worth, then I'm going to do that. Because I wish somebody had done it for me, but more importantly, I just remember that person sitting at that airport lounge, so uncertain about their life, so uncertain, and it broke my heart.
Yeah, I've been in those situations talking to students or children just like that. And you're absolutely correct. And it drives me nuts because the I hear religious folks talk about unconditional love, and then I hear religious folks put condition on love. And it makes me so sad, especially when it comes to their children. Like, I could never imagine a world where I would be willing to stop talking to any one of my children forever.
I agree. And from that moment on, I had said that, there was absolutely no way that, no matter who my daughter was with, no matter what she told me, I've always been a firm believer in not putting people down. I never, ever have said to her, "Oh, you're bad," because it's not the person that's bad. It may be the actions that they've done, but it's not the person that's bad. And I always said that I was always going to support her, because my parents had never supported me. And I wanted to make sure that she always felt supported. But it doesn't just stay with her. There are so many people out there. There are so many young kids out there that don't have that support at home. And if they don't get that support when they're in school, when they're in the classroom, when they are with their peer group, when they're in common rooms, etc., then if they're not getting that support there, then where are they getting that support? They're either not, or they're getting it in some very salubrious places. And that's not necessarily a good thing either.
Absolutely. So we're going to start winding down. And I have one question for you that can be about corporate training. It could be about your experience as an adjunct faculty member. But what do you think the educational community can do to be more inclusive of queer people?
Exactly the opposite of what they're trying to do right now. I think it's probably the best answer I can give. I mean, stop banning books. We are taking away so many support systems for our kids. So many. For absolutely no reason whatsoever, other than vanity and somebody else's own beliefs, and trying to force them onto our children. I think our kids need to be a little bit freer to explore who they are. And I'm not talking necessarily in any sort of sexual way, but just explore themselves, to be free, not to be forced into, oh, you were born in this particular gender, so therefore I'm going to make you wear pink dresses and I'm going to take you down the Barbie aisle. That's the sort of thing that we really need to stop. And we need to stop restricting our kids. Years ago, I remember the original movie Footloose. And there was a part in that movie where I was in England at the time. I was a youngster, and I remember looking at this, and they were burning books. And I remember thinking to myself, why would you do that? Books are where you learn things. Why would you burn books? And here we are in the US in the 2000s, and we are doing exactly the same thing. So my advice to the educational community is stop it. For goodness sake, why do we have to try and make what's in a movie reality? We don't need to. Allow our kids freedom and give them the support, because they quite often don't have it at home. So give them support and allow them that freedom to express themselves, and to express themselves how they want to express themselves, and stop trying to force them into little... One of the things that we are accused of in our community is we're accused of creating labels for ourselves. And, we're accused of creating our own little niche. Gay pride is one that's, oh, why do we need pride? But we're not the culprits here. Actually, you're the culprits here. If I look at these straight communities and I say, but what you're doing is you're forcing a gender on somebody that might not be comfortable with that. You are forcing a way to act and to behave and to conduct your life on people that might not be comfortable with that. We're not the ones forcing anything. We're advocating for more freedom, but you're trying to force people into little boxes. And I beg of every single teacher to give your kid that flexibility and that freedom to be who they want to be, rather than to try and force them into a little box. You were born this gender, so therefore you must like camo. That's just ridiculous. We've got to stop it.
I love camo and eating deer. That soundbite right there, like that whole section was just so impactful, because we've alluded to this throughout our conversation, but oftentimes the people accusing us of things are the ones actually doing it. And they're the ones that have created this heterosexual box that we're all expected to live in, and we were groomed into this. We were told that this is who you have to be, and you're exactly correct. The books are being banned because of someone else's opinion and them trying to force it upon our children, all children, which is exactly what we're being accused of, which we are not doing.
I was taught by an English teacher once, many, many years ago. She said to me, never stop reading, because by reading, you will learn so much. You will gain so many different perspectives. So never, ever stop reading. It doesn't matter whether it's a magazine article. It doesn't matter whether it's a book. It doesn't matter whether it's a kid's book. Read to gain a wider perspective. And I still say that to our kids now. Read to gain a wider perspective. And you know what? There's a lot of these straight people that are trying to ban books. Why don't you read one first? Try and understand that perspective and make a decision. Then form an opinion. Don't form an opinion based on the cover or based on a title. Form an opinion, an educated opinion. And that's what's missing.
I argue in the comments. I'm a comment arguer. I know people say not to do it, but I do it. And one of the comments on YouTube recently about the podcast was basically someone accusing us of like trying to keep up with the Joneses when it comes to like, we're just trying to emulate heteronormativity. So basically accusing all queer people of homonormativity. If you really believe that, then maybe you should listen to the podcast. Like, why don't you give a few episodes a listen and tell me whether or not you actually believe through these people's lived experiences that that's what's happening here? Because you really do need to educate yourself. We are here at our final question, and this one actually comes from a listener. And so this is our Ask an Educator question, and comes from Austin in Georgia. And Austin asks, why did you go into education?
Well, hi, Austin. Really nice to meet you. Why did I go into education? I'm not going to lie. I fell into it. It was purely by accident. And then I discovered that I actually enjoyed it and that people liked it. So that's how I ended up in education. I had been working in IT for a number of years, and I'd gone to a training class actually, and I found this to be so enigmatic. He was an absolute, he just commanded the classroom. And I remember watching him thinking, I'd like to do that. And so that was when I approached him and I said, I want to be you. And he said, actually, I think that you've got the right personality. I think you could. And so I just said, okay, where do I start? And that's where I really got into the intricacies of teaching and everything about learning all about how to behave in a classroom. And I don't mean be a good person, but certain things like make sure you're talking to everybody in the room and make sure that everybody's awake, because if they're sleeping, they're not learning anything, that sort of thing. And so I fell into it. And then I found out that I actually enjoyed it. But more importantly than that, I started getting people asking for me by name. And that's really how I got started. And then I was asked to come over to the States. And this was not me trying to come over to the States. This was actually an organization saying, we'd like you to come over to the US and we'd like you to teach. And so I accepted. And here I am. I'm still doing exactly the same thing. I still love it. There are still challenges. There are days when I get absolutely burnt out. There are some days when I'll turn off my laptop, or I come home and I'm sort of, I don't want to do this anymore. But then you know what? Give it another week. I miss the classroom. I miss that interaction of the classroom. I'm going to take another class on. And so I fell into it by accident. I absolutely loved it. And you know what? I love the influence that I can have. And as long as I can have a positive influence, and as long as people see value in what I have got to teach, then I'm not going to stop either.
Thanks, Austin, for your question. If you would like to hear your question and you're listening at home or on your walk or run or wherever, you can click the Ask a Queer Educator link in the podcast episode, and then it will send me a text message with your question. Jo, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it. I just thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you as well, Brian. I have absolutely enjoyed our conversation too. And I hope that people not only people enjoy our conversation, but I really hope that, people can take something away from this, and that really, all I ask is that everybody listening, just give our kids a chance. Please, that's all I ask. And that's my own personal plea to everybody.
Today we talked about navigating professional environments as a queer individual, understanding the importance of inclusive education and its impact on student well-being, and we learned some practical strategies for fostering supportive spaces for LGBTQ+ individuals in educational settings. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Teaching While Queer. Connect with fellow queer educators and your favorite guests on our online community at www.teachingwhilequeer.org. New community members receive a free resource focused on creating an inclusive classroom environment. Have a great day.